There's a peculiar thing about corruption in frontier towns. It never announces itself by name. It slips in wearing borrowed authority, drapes a badge around the neck of the cruelest man it can find, and tells everybody within earshot that this right here, is justice. New Mexico Territory. Autumn of 1884. A town called Cobre Flats, a young widow by the name of Della Henley was doing what she had been doing every single day since her husband died, holding together the freight and mercantile business he had hammered into existence from nothing but nerve and borrowed tools. She was being squeezed dry over a debt she had never agreed to. The men doing the squeezing had already written her ending in their heads. What those men hadn't done, what would cost them everything, and was asked around about the quiet stranger who had drifted into Cobre Flats 3 days before they arrived. The one with the slight drag in his left leg. The one who spoke to nobody and seemed to be watching everything, because that man had left their employer bleeding in a ditch outside Santa Fe 2 years earlier, and their employer had a long memory. They should have asked. They didn't. That choice was going to matter. But before we ride back to Cobre Flats and find out what happened when things finally cracked open, if stories about ordinary people holding the line against men with too much money and not enough conscience mean something to you, hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. And tell me, partner, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your town down in the comments. I read every one of them. Now, let's go back to New Mexico Territory, autumn of 1884. And the morning the whole situation in Cobre Flats started coming apart at the seams. Henley Freight and Mercantile occupied the west side of Main Street, wedged between a blacksmith shop and a feed store, which meant it was exactly the kind of business that kept a working town alive. Not glamorous, not profitable in any grand sense, but necessary in every sense that counted. Caleb Henley had opened those doors in 1880 with a single borrowed wagon and a mule he'd named Senator, because Caleb used to say both the mule and the Senator were reasonably functional in good weather and couldn't be trusted anywhere near money. Caleb died of a blood infection in the spring of '03. Della had kept the doors open every morning since. That fact alone told you more about who she was than most people could express in a full conversation. She was 26 years old, brown hair braided and tucked beneath a wide canvas hat, gray eyes that were neither pleading nor unkind, just steady. The kind of steady that comes from necessity rather than performance. She had learned bookkeeping from her father back in Missouri, and she applied those skills to every freight ledger and supply invoice that crossed her counter, because in 1884, a woman running a business without a man's name attached to it had to be sharper than everyone else in the room just to break even. Most days, she managed it. Trouble arrived in a suit. His name was Preston Cavell. He ran Cavell Consolidated Freight out of Las Cruces, a man of 43, well padded, with the clean, careful hands of someone who had organized his entire life around never having to do anything physical. Silver watch chain, polished brown derby. The practiced patience of a man who considers waiting to be a form of generosity he extends to lesser people. Cavell had been pushing his freight operation northward for 2 years, buying out smaller operators wherever he could. When buying failed, other arrangements tended to follow. He arrived in Cobre Flats in late September carrying a document he claimed was a debt instrument, a promissory note for $160, allegedly signed by Caleb Henley back in 1882. The problem was simple. Caleb Henley had never borrowed a single dollar from Preston Cavell in his life. Della knew it the way she knew her own reflection. The second problem was Deputy Harlan Briggs, the only law Cobre Flats could claim. Briggs owed Cavell money, had owed it long enough that the debt had stopped feeling like a chain and started feeling like a partnership. That was a distinction that mattered greatly to Briggs and mattered not at all to the law he was supposed to represent. Cavell had also brought muscle from Las Cruces. Not freight clerks, something else entirely. The first was a man named Deke Tully, 6 feet 2 inches, jaw like the front of a freight wagon, a reputation along the Rio Grande for doing his heaviest work when no one was around to see it. He carried 2 revolvers and looked at women the way a patient predator looks at something that hasn't started running yet. His particular weakness was certainty. He had always been certain about everything, and that certainty had made him both dangerous and sloppy in equal measure. The second man was younger, Caleb Oren, 24, with the hollow, straining look of someone trying hard to convince himself that the men he worked for were the right kind of men. His weakness was loyalty without principle. The most corrosive kind, because it never turns on its object and cannot be reasoned away. The third piece of this arrangement was Briggs himself, 51 years old. Gray mustache, badge worn slightly crooked, tilted from the last time someone had grabbed at his collar. His wound was resentment. He had wanted to be a sheriff his whole life and had topped out at deputy, and that particular failure had never healed cleanly. Men like Briggs usually don't begin corrupt. They arrive at it gradually, water finding the low point in the ground through years of small surrenders, each one just slightly easier than the last. On the morning of October the 4th, all three of them walked into Henley Freight together. Della was behind the counter, tallying a manifest, when the bell above the door announced them. She had been expecting it. Cavell had sent word the previous afternoon. She had spent the night deciding she would not be moved. Cavell placed the promissory note on the counter with the reverence of a man presenting sacred text. "Mrs. Henley," he said, "my patience has limits." "It's had limits since you walked into this building the first time," Della said. She didn't touch the paper. A lawyer in Albuquerque had already looked at a copy and told her the signature bore a suspicious resemblance to Caleb Henley's name as it appeared on an unrelated bill of sale from 2 years earlier. Proving forgery required evidence. Gathering evidence required time, and time was exactly what Cavell was trying to steal from her. "The note comes due at month's end," Cavell said, spreading his hands in the manner of a reasonable man. $160. I'm willing to accept the business itself in place of full payment. That's a generous resolution. That's armed robbery dressed in paperwork, Della said. Behind Cavell, Tully made a sound, short and flat, like a boot dropping into a puddle. "Mind your language." "Ma'am?" Briggs said from the doorway, studying the street outside as though this whole exchange were a minor clerical matter. Legal terminology can turn on a person who doesn't understand what they're saying. Della looked at the deputy for a long, measured moment. "Legal terminology," she said, "is precisely what's going to resolve this. In a circuit court before a judge, not across my counter." Cavell picked up the note without hurrying. "End of the month," he repeated, smiling on his way out. The bell rang again. The mercantile went quiet. Della stood alone behind the counter with the smell of pipe smoke and boot leather settling around her, and her hands flat against the wood. She had promised herself she wouldn't shake. She almost managed it. The rider came in from the South Road 2 mornings later, on a gray Appaloosa mare wearing road dust in every crease of her coat. Most travelers from Las Cruces used that road, which meant he could have been anybody. But anybody coming into town would have ridden straight to the livery or made for the saloon. This man rode to the water trough at the edge of the main street, let his horse drink, and sat very still in the saddle studying the town the way you study a place you've seen in a bad dream, checking the details to see whether they match. He was lean through the shoulders, the kind of build that looks ordinary at a distance and less ordinary the closer you get. Clean-shaved, somewhere in his early 30s, though the trail dust on him suggested more years than his face did. Dark hair beneath a plainsman's hat with a brim worn thin by weather. He wore a canvas duster the color of weathered timber, and a Colt single-action army mounted on his hip for a cross-draw, the kind of carry most men wouldn't notice until it was already happening. The limp was what people saw first. A small hitch in his left stride, the kind of hitch that says a wound healed fast or healed wrong or both. It made him look like a man who had been used up in some fundamental way. It made people look past him instead of at him. If you'd been watching long enough, you might have noticed that was useful. He paid for a week's board at the Livery and Coin and gave his name at the Sandstone Hotel, 2-story adobe that called itself a hotel and functioned mostly as a boarding house, as coal. Just coal. That evening he ate quietly in the dining room with his back to the wall, the way a man sits who learned that lesson through pain rather than advice, watching the street through the window. Deputy Harlan Briggs was at the far end of the counter, eating steak and talking too loudly about the decline of sensible people in New Mexico territory. Cole listened to Briggs for 12 minutes. Then he paid for his meal and went upstairs. The next morning, he limped down to the mercantile and bought 2 lengths of rope, a tin of axle grease, and a box of rifle shells. Della was behind the counter. She noticed the limp. She noticed the stillness in him, and the way he looked at shelves with the focused economy of a man buying exactly what he needed, not what he thought he needed, which was different from most customers in a way she couldn't quite put words to. Passing through? She asked. Not quite yet, he said. He paid and left. She watched him through the window for a moment and didn't think much more about it. Not until later that day, when Deke Tully came in to buy tobacco and made a point of leaning against the counter longer than any purchase required, speaking in that particular low register that isn't quite a threat and isn't quite conversation. It lives in the uncomfortable space between. The boss is running low on patience, Tully said. His patience is his own concern, Della said. It doesn't change what's legal. Depends on who's doing the reading, Tully said. He tipped his hat. He left. It was the 3rd time something like that had happened in 3 days. Each iteration smaller and more casual than the last, because that's how intimidation functions when it wants to look like nothing. It stacks small moments until the cumulative weight of them becomes unbearable. That evening, when Della went to lock the rear door, she found the latch had been forced. Not broken, just bent. Someone had opened it and closed it again. Nothing was gone. The message was in the act of opening itself. She stood in the fading light for a moment and made a decision. She was not losing this building. That same evening, she posted a letter to the circuit court in Albuquerque requesting a date for a fraud hearing. Subscribe right now. Partner, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're sitting, because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and I want to know who's still awake for them. The following morning, Cole was on the bench outside the hotel when Della walked past on her way to open the mercantile. He nodded, she nodded back. She had seen enough drifters come through Cobre Flats to think nothing of it. What she didn't know was that Cole had already spent that morning mapping the town in a way that had nothing to do with killing. He knew where the 3 alleys behind Main Street ran. He knew the angle of the stable's rear gate. He knew which roofline sat highest with the clearest sightline to the road from Las Cruces. He had done this kind of accounting in other towns, in other difficult situations, and the currency he paid with was attention. He had also spent part of the morning following Caleb Oren at a distance of 1 block through 2 streets and a livery alley, long enough to understand the chain of command. Oren went where Tully said. Tully went where Cavell said, and Cavell hadn't yet decided what to do about the deadline. That meant things would stay quiet for a few more days before turning loud very quickly. Cole was eating lunch at the sandstone counter when Briggs sat down, beside him uninvited. It was the kind of thing Briggs did with strangers. It established hierarchy. You've been in town about 4 days, Briggs said, talking to his coffee cup. About that? Cole said, most travelers move on by the 2nd day. I'm not most travelers. Briggs turned and looked at him directly. The move of a man asserting priority. What's your business here? Resting a horse, Cole said. Briggs looked at the limp. Looked back at his coffee. Filed the man away as nothing significant. Don't overstay your welcome, he said. Cole reached into his coat pocket for a coin to set beside his plate. An ordinary movement, but it shifted the duster back from the Colt for a half-second. Long enough for anyone paying attention to see the grip in the holster. More specifically, long enough for Briggs to see how that holster was positioned and mounted. Not the standard carry. Something else. Something deliberate. Briggs finished his coffee quietly. He did not go to Cavell right away. Men like Briggs don't move quickly when they haven't yet identified what they're looking at. That hesitation was going to cost Cavell something. Neither of them knew it yet. On the morning of October the 9th, Cavell sent Tully and Oren to the mercantile with a revised proposal. This one wasn't framed as a business discussion. Tully positioned himself on one side of the counter. Oren stood near the door. Tully set his hands flat on the wood, the same gesture Cavell had used, but with a different weight behind it. Mr. Cavell is prepared to offer you $300 cash for this business, Tully said. Sign the deed today, walk away clear of the debt, and keep the money. That's a clean arrangement. Della recognized the arithmetic. It was the kind where whoever was doing the calculation had already decided on the answer before they walked in the door. "Tell Mr. Cavell this business isn't for sale." Tully leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Henley," he said, pronouncing her name the way a man records a fact, not acknowledges a person. "I'd think carefully about that." "I think carefully every day," she said. "It's served me reasonably well so far." Tully pushed back from the counter and let his eyes move slowly around the mercantile, the evaluating gaze of a man measuring square footage. "Fine building," he said. "These old adobe structures, though. Roof timbers have a way of failing without warning. Dry climate does it." He said it quietly, without particular emphasis, and walked out. Della stood very still after the door closed. They were no longer talking about the law. Cole was outside when Tully and Orrin emerged. He was on the bench across the street, whittling nothing in particular, a habit he'd developed years ago as a reason to keep his hands occupied while his eyes did actual work. He watched Tully's stride, the walk of a man who has stopped expecting consequences. He watched Orrin's, shorter steps, slightly quickened, the pace of a man moving inside someone else's gravity. Then he crossed the street and went into the mercantile. Della looked up when the bell rang. She saw the quiet man with the limp, not who she'd expected. "You heard," she said. "It wasn't really a question." "Enough," Cole said. He set his hat on the counter. "The one who did the talking, he's been here before?" "Twice. He works for a man named Preston Cavell. Cavell consolidated out of Las Cruces." Something shifted in Cole's expression. "Not much. You have a lawyer working on the note in Albuquerque?" "I sent a letter about a hearing." "How long before you get a date?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3, Cole nodded slowly. "Family in town?" "No family. 2 employees, and I sent them home early today. I didn't want them near Tully." Cole looked out the window at the street. A long pause settled between them, the kind where a person is deciding whether to step forward or step back, and both of them can feel the weight of it. "Leave her be," Cole said, almost to himself. Della frowned. "What?" He looked at her. "That's what I said to the last man who worked for Cavell, before I said anything else to him." The mercantile held its quiet for a moment. "You've crossed Cavell before," Della said. "Once," Cole said. "He hired someone to torch a freight yard in Santa Fe. The fire went wrong. A woman was hurt." His jaw tightened at something only he could see. "I made certain the man he hired didn't work for him after that. Cavell held me responsible for that." "Fair enough," he paused. "And now he's in your town." "And now he's in your town," Della said. Cole picked up his hat. "I can't promise you the circuit court moves fast enough, but I can promise you that if Cavell decides to push this past words, he is going to find the ground considerably harder than he's expecting." Della studied him. The limp, the quiet, the flat, map-like recognition in his voice when he said Cavell's name, the recognition of a man describing somewhere he had already been. "Who are you?" she asked. Cole settled his hat on his head. "Someone who has a conversation left to finish with Cavell," he said, and he walked out. She watched him through the window. He crossed the street at the same unhurried pace, the slight catch in his stride ticking like a clock. And for the first time in several days, she thought something she hadn't thought in a while. She was not doing this alone. That evening, she let him in through the back of the mercantile, through the storage room entrance. She made coffee on the small stove she kept back there for winter inventory tallying, and they sat on opposite sides of the work table with the lamp between them. She asked him his full name. "Cole Reardon," he said. Something moved through her expression. Subtle, but there. "I've heard that name," she said. "Most people in New Mexico have," he said, without any particular satisfaction in it. Cole Reardon had come to New Mexico territory from the Texas Panhandle, though before that it had been Colorado and Arizona, and before that a stretch in Wyoming he didn't discuss in any detail. He was 32 years old. The limp came from a bullet that had clipped the outer edge of his left femur during a confrontation in Tucson in 1881. A confrontation that had not been his idea, and that ended badly for the man who'd made it his idea. He had been offered deputy positions in 3 separate towns and turned down all 3. Not from any opposition to law, but from a specific objection to staying still. He was the kind of man who understood the value of permanence without being able to sustain it in himself, a particular species of loneliness he had learned, to carry without requiring anyone else to share the weight. He told Della about Santa Fe, not everything, but enough. The freight yard, the fire, the woman named Mrs. Alcott, 60 years old, a bookkeeper who had been sleeping in the back office of the yard because she was saving every cent toward a train ticket to see her daughter in El Paso. She had gotten out with burns on both arms that would bother her for the rest of her life. Cole had been in Santa Fe on separate business, close enough to the yard to pull Mrs. Alcott clear before the smoke reached her lungs. He had also been close enough to recognize Cavell's man, someone called Ruiz, and to understand exactly why that particular yard had been targeted. The owner had refused to sell. Just like Della. He's done this before, Della said. At least twice that I know of, Cole said. And both times the property changed hands. And both times the owners walked away with less than the land was worth and were grateful to be walking away at all. Della looked at her coffee. He is not getting this building, she said quietly. The tone of a person who has stopped asking themselves whether something is possible and started asking themselves how it gets done. No, Cole said. He's not. He looked at the ceiling, a habit of thought. You keep the rear alley unlocked at night? I've been locking it since they bent the latch. Good. Keep it that way. Don't use the front entrance after dark. He stood, turned his hat in his hands, then stopped. You ever fired a rifle? My husband's Winchester is in the back room. Can you hit what you're aiming at? At close range. It's been a while. We'll fix that. The next morning was a Sunday. Most of Cobre Flats was either at church or sleeping off Saturday night. Cole brought Della out to the flat ground behind the freight yard, where the land opened toward a line of mesquite scrub before the desert took over. He'd propped 3 tin cans on a split-rail fence post at different distances. He walked her through the Winchester's action first. The lever, how a round seated. The way the stock needed to sit against the shoulder. He talked about breathing the way a man talks who has given it genuine consideration, who understands that most people breathe wrong. When fear enters the picture, the fear doesn't leave, he told her. You learn to breathe inside it instead of waiting for it to go. She missed the first 2 shots and hit the third solidly enough to send the can spinning into the mesquite. He adjusted the angle of her elbow, just that. She hit the next 2 in a row. Again, he said. She fired until the cartridges were gone. By the last few rounds, she was hitting the middle target consistently, not flinching on the shot, carrying that particular stillness that settles over people. When they realize they are capable of something, they believed they weren't. Cole reloaded the rifle and handed it back. Keep it behind the counter, he said. Not hidden, visible. You think it'll come to that? I think men like Tully do the math on risk. Show him the rifle is part of the equation and the math changes. He spent the afternoon on other preparations he didn't explain in detail. He walked into the hardware store and bought a coil of thin wire, a handful of small cowbells, and 2 lanterns. He had a 20-minute conversation with the blacksmith 2 doors down from the mercantile. He walked the rear alley behind Main Street twice, counting paces between doors and fence posts, and crouched once at the mouth of the alley for a long stretch studying the angles, the way someone studies a chessboard, before the game starts rather than during it. Cole had been in enough contested situations to understand one fundamental truth. Preparation was the only honest substitute for certainty. He couldn't know precisely what Cavell would do or when, but he could make the terrain costly and then wait. 2 nights after the rifle practice, he strung a length of wire low across the rear alley entrance, tied to 1 cowbell on a fence post. He placed a second bell at the corner where the alley met the side street. He showed Della where each wire was and how to step over them in the dark. He moved both lanterns to positions inside the storage room that would throw light across the alley without silhouetting him when he needed to move. They'll most likely come at night, he told her, before the hearing date if they're going to move at all. How many? Tully, Orrin, and probably a hired third. Cavell doesn't come himself for this kind of work, Della nodded. She had passed the point of hoping the threat would dissolve on its own. Some people never make it past that point. The fear keeps them frozen where they stand. She had made it through, and on the other side of it was something that wasn't quite bravery but felt like clarity. A cold, workable clarity. The rifle stays loaded, Cole said. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not approval exactly. Something quieter. The recognition one person has for another who has decided to hold their position. Cavell will push through legal channels first, Cole said. He'll lean on Briggs to serve some kind of notice, probably in the next day or two. Don't engage Briggs directly. Accept the paper. Say nothing. Get it to your lawyer. And if Briggs tries to arrest you? Cole almost smiled. Briggs isn't going to arrest me. How do you know that? Because he looked at my holster last week and he spent 48 hours deciding I wasn't a problem. A pause. I want him to keep thinking that. The next day, exactly as predicted, Briggs served Della with a civil notice, a paper designed to look like a real legal instrument enforcing the debt under territorial law. The distinction required a lawyer to identify. Cole watched from across the street as Briggs emerged from the mercantile and walked south toward the saloon, satisfied with himself. Then Cavell made his mistake. That evening, in the saloon, within clear earshot of 3 separate tables of local men, Deke Tully made a remark about Della Henley, about what she'd be doing with herself once the business matter was resolved. The comment crossed from threatening into something uglier, something that had nothing to do with freight routes or debt instruments. 2 of the men at those tables had been doing business with Henley Freight for years. One of them was the blacksmith Cole had spoken with 3 days. Earlier, word reached Cole at his hotel, within the hour. He put on his coat and hat and walked to the saloon. He found Tully at the bar, half a glass of whiskey in front of him, Orrin on his left, open space on his right. Cole sat down in that open space. Tully looked at him with the expression of a man identifying a minor inconvenience. Drifter, Tully said. Heard something in this room tonight, Cole said. He ordered a whiskey and didn't pick it up. Saloon's full of somethings. Something specific, Cole said. About Mrs. Henley. Tully shifted on his stool, the body announcing a confrontation before the mouth does. That's not your territory. Leave her alone, Cole said. Quiet. Settled. The tone of a man stating a conclusion he arrived at some time ago. Tully studied him. The room around them had gotten less loud in a precise radius, the way rooms do when everyone is listening without appearing to. Orrin had set his glass down. You got a stake in this, Drifter? Tully asked. Call it a preference, Cole said. Tully smiled the long, easy smile of a man who has decided he doesn't need to be concerned. You understand who you're dealing with? Preston Cavell runs freight from El Paso to Albuquerque. He has lawyers. He has judges in his pocket. He has enough money to make the law say whatever he needs it to say. Men who need the law to say something specific, Cole said, are usually less secure than they feel. Tully's smile went away. I'll say this once, Drifter. Saddle your horse in the morning. Cole looked at his whiskey. He pushed it 1 inch back across the bar. A small, unhurried movement. Before tomorrow, he said, you ought to ask around about who you're talking to. The man who knows my name in Las Cruces. Ask him what he remembers about Santa Fe. Then come back and tell me whether Cavell still wants to push this forward. He stood up, set a coin on the bar, and walked out. Tully watched him go. Orrin watched Tully. The room breathed again. Tully did not ask around. That was his error, the specific error made by men who have been right about most drifters for long enough that they've stopped making room for exceptions. A letter arrived from Las Cruces 2 days later, addressed to Cavell. Cole didn't know what it contained. He knew it mattered because Cavell arrived in person on the afternoon of October the 14th, something he hadn't done before, and which meant the situation had grown past what he was comfortable managing from a distance. Cavell met with Briggs first, a private meeting in the deputy's office beside the jailhouse. Cole watched through the window from across the street at the livery for 20 minutes. The length of the meeting said it was substantive. Then Cavell went to the saloon. That night, Cole knocked at the back door of the mercantile. Della let him in. She had the Winchester leaning against the storage room wall and the lamp turned low. He's here, she said. She'd seen Cavell in the street that afternoon. I know. He'll move before the week is out. The hearing date will be set soon, and he knows it. How do you know the hearing will be set? Cole reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Letter from your lawyer in Albuquerque. It came to the hotel, addressed to me by arrangement. Hearing set for October the 22nd. Della stared at him. You arranged that? I wrote to him 8 days ago. Your original letter was going to take 6 weeks. We don't have 6 weeks. She took the paper and read it. A circuit court hearing October 22, 1884, in Cobre Flats before Judge Emmett Slade regarding the validity of the Henley debt instrument. 8 days, she said. You started this 8 days ago. When I walked out of your mercantile the first morning. She looked at him across the lamplight. Something in the moment neither of them addressed directly. A recognition that the ground had shifted in a way that extended beyond forged notes and freight. Debts, Cole Reardon, she said. Quietly. Just making sure the ground is level, he said. She put the letter in her coat pocket. Cavell will know about the hearing by morning, which is why tonight matters. He gestured at the lanterns, the Winchester, the locked door. Everything's in position. The wires are set in the alley. Cavell doesn't know, Briggs doesn't know, Tully doesn't know. He glanced up. There's a stable boy named Marsh who sleeps in the hay at the livery. I paid him $2 to come knock on my hotel room door if he sees men moving in the alley after midnight. Della looked at him. You've been preparing for this for a week. 9 days, he said. He went back to the hotel. He sat in his room with his boots on, lamp off, window open just wide enough to hear the street below. Marsh knocked at 1 a.m. Cole was already moving when the knock came. Coat on, hat on! The Colt checked and holstered. He told the boy to go back to the livery and stay there, and he moved down the hotel's rear staircase and into the back alley of Main Street in under a minute. He heard them before he could see them. 3 men moving with the particular noise of people who believe they are moving quietly, which is a different thing entirely from actually moving quietly. Tully led. Orrin followed. Behind both of them, a third man Cole didn't recognize. Older, with the practiced economy of movement that comes from being paid for this kind of work before. They were carrying torches. Not yet lit fire, not intimidation. The conclusion was cold and clear. The first wire caught Orrin at the ankle, and the cowbell rang once, sharp and clean in the nighttime silence. Orrin went sideways into the alley fence with a noise substantially louder than any cowbell. Tully froze. The third man reached for his revolver. Cole was already in the alley. Guns on the ground, he said. He said it at a normal volume without raising his voice, which was considerably more unsettling than shouting would have been. Both hands where I can see them. Tully turned. He saw Cole, the Colt level, the posture completely still. And for the first time, he saw what Briggs had seen in the hotel dining room. The bearing, the placement, the total absence of urgency in a man pointing a weapon at 3 other men in a dark alley. You're Cole Reardon, Tully said, the way a man says something that suddenly clarifies several other things he'd previously misread. Guns on the ground, Cole said. Tully bent slowly and placed his right revolver in the dirt. The third man, smarter than Orrin, set his down without being asked again. Orrin, pressing one hand to his ribs and pulling himself upright against the fence, had never gotten his revolver clear of the holster. He left it there. The back door of the mercantile opened. Della stood in the doorway with the Winchester leveled, stock against her shoulder. Elbow at the angle Cole had corrected that Sunday morning. The barrel steady, the alley went completely still. Tully looked at the rifle. He looked at Cole. He looked at the torches lying in the dirt where Orrin had dropped them when the cowbell rang. Fire, Cole said, flat, declarative. Not a question, not an accusation, a fact being entered into a permanent record in front of witnesses. He glanced toward the roofline of the hardware store, where the blacksmith's apprentice had been sitting against the chimney since 11 o'clock, with a clear angle on the alley below. Cole had asked him to be there. 2 witnesses. Tully's jaw worked for a moment. Briggs will have you out of a jail cell by morning, he said. The last position available to a man who has run out of better options. Mrs. Henley, Cole said. Della did not lower the Winchester. She kept it level, covering the space between Tully and Orrin, not picking one, covering both the way Cole had shown her. More effective than committing to either target because neither man knows which one the barrel is for. Deke Tully, she said. Her voice was steady, not the steadiness of someone who isn't afraid, but of someone who has decided that fear is not the same thing as being stopped. Tell me clearly whether Mr. Cavell ordered this, or whether this was your own judgment. Because when I describe this evening to Judge Slade on October the 22nd, I want the correct name on the correct act." Tully said nothing. "Mr. Cavell," Della said. Not a question. Tully's eyes moved to the side. "That was enough. On your knees," Cole said. "All three of you. Hands on your heads." They went down. Orrin first. Then the third man. Then Tully, with the particular deliberateness of someone trying to preserve a shred of dignity from an undignified position, Cole went to the mouth of the alley. "Marsh," he called. The livery boy appeared at the far end with a lantern. "Go get the blacksmith," Cole said. "Tell him we need someone to hold 3 men until morning." Citizens of Cobre Flats who had no particular love for Harlan Briggs, and who had spent a week watching Della Henley pressured over a debt she didn't owe, agreed to stand watch over the 3 men in the freight yard until the deputy arrived. Cole had arranged for word to reach Briggs by a route that would take 2 hours. By the time Briggs arrived, there were 5 local men standing in that freight yard. 2 of them had been Caleb Henley's freight customers for years. One of them had personally watched Tully light those torches before Orrin tripped the wire. The torches were still on the ground. The 2 men from the hardware store roof had come down and were willing to say what they'd seen. When Briggs looked at the torches, and at the witnesses, and at Cole Reardon standing quietly against the freight yard fence with his arms folded and a very specific expression on his face, Briggs made the only calculation left available to him. He arrested Tully and the third man, whose name turned out to be Garrett. He released Orrin, which told Cole that Orrin had already started talking, which was exactly what Cole had expected. Preston Cavell left Cobre Flats on the morning of October the 15th. He didn't visit the mercantile before he left. He rode south on the Las Cruces Road with the smooth, unhurried bearing of a man concluding a routine business trip. If you hadn't known the story, you wouldn't have read anything into his departure. But the story was known. By the time the morning stage came through, most of Cobre Flats knew it. The kind of knowing that moves through small towns faster than anything printed, in the particular currency of people who needed something to be true and found out that it was. On October the 22nd, Judge Emmett Slade convened a hearing in the Cobre Flats meeting hall and examined the Henley debt instrument alongside 3 supporting documents Cole had obtained from a freight records clerk in Las Cruces who had found inconsistencies in Cavell's filing. Dates. The hearing ran 4 hours. At the conclusion, Judge Slade voided the instrument as fraudulent and entered a formal finding against Cavell Consolidated Freight Company. 2 weeks later, a territorial investigator arrived to examine Briggs's conduct as deputy. Briggs resigned before the week was out. Della didn't hear any of this directly from Cole, because Cole was no longer in Cobre Flats by the time the investigation began. He had ridden out on the morning of October the 17th, 2 days after the night in the alley. She had known he was leaving. She'd known it the way you know weather is building, not from anything said, but from the particular quality of quiet the day before it arrives. He came to the mercantile on the morning of the 17th and bought a paper twist of tobacco he didn't smoke. She made coffee. They sat in the storage room the way they had twice before, and she asked him where he was headed. "South," he said. "For now." She looked at her cup. Outside on Main Street, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its morning. The blacksmith's hammer, a wagon on the road, a dog occupied with something that seemed urgent only to the dog. "The ground's level," she said. "Mostly," he said. She looked up. "Will Cavell come back?" "Not here," Cole said. "His pattern is to find easier ground after a loss. You'll hear from his lawyers once more and then nothing." She nodded. She believed him because he said true things rather than comfortable things, a distinction she had come to value in the 2 weeks she had known him. "The Winchester's behind the counter," she said. "Good," he said. She walked him to the front of the mercantile when he left. The gray Appaloosa was at the rail, saddled, road dust already on her coat from wherever she'd been standing in the early morning. Cole put on his hat and gathered the reins. He looked at her for a moment, one of those long, quiet looks that carry several things that aren't being said, which is the most honest form of communication a certain kind of person is capable of. "Cole," she said. He waited. "Thank you," she said. Not for the hearing specifically, not for the night in the alley specifically, just that. "All of it." He nodded once, the way a man nods when there is more to say, and he has decided that saying it wouldn't serve either of them well. Then he turned the Appaloosa south, the slight catch of his left leg as he mounted. He rode down Main Street at a walk, the same pace he'd ridden in with, and he didn't look back at the mercantile. She watched him until the road dust wrapped itself around him and the street was ordinary again. Della Henley kept Henley. Freight and mercantile opened through 1884 and into 1885. That spring, she hired 2 freight drivers and extended the route north toward Santa Fe. By 1887, she was running 3 wagons and had brought on a bookkeeper of her own, and had built a reputation in Cobre Flats as the kind of businesswoman you did not want to challenge over a debt, real or invented. She kept Caleb's Winchester behind the counter for the rest of her life, not because she expected to need it, because it reminded her of a particular Sunday morning behind the freight yard, when she had discovered that the thing she'd been most afraid of was something she was, in fact, capable of facing. I've been keeping this fire going for a good long while now, partner, and I've told a lot of stories about this country, about the people who built things out here in the dust and the wind and the silence, and about the people who showed up trying to take those things away. And the thing I keep coming back to is this. The frontier didn't belong to the men with the most firepower. It didn't belong to the men with the deepest pockets. It didn't belong to the men who bent the law into whatever shape they needed and called it order. In the end, it belonged to the people who refused to quit, who held their position even when the position felt like it was crumbling, who found, when the moment actually arrived, that they had more in them than their fear had been willing to admit. A drifter with a limp and a reputation that preceded him rode into Cobre Flats, left it better than he found it, and moved on because that is what some people do. Not because something is chasing them, because the road keeps making space for them, and they haven't yet found the place where it runs out. Preston Cavell, for what it's worth, had his freight licenses suspended by territorial regulators in 1886 and relocated to California, where, presumably, the conditions suited him better. Some men find softer ground. That is not the same as finding peace. And somewhere south of Cobre Flats, on a road that runs between the mountains and the open desert, a man with a slight hitch in his stride on a gray Appaloosa was already figuring out what the next town needed. Keep your powder dry, partner. Keep your word honest. This story is a work of fiction, drawn from the traditions of frontier storytelling and the historical record of New Mexico Territory in the 1880s. If this one found you in a good place tonight, leave a like and subscribe to Ride Along for more stories like it. I want to know where you're listening from and which part of this story stayed with you longest. Until our trails cross again.